Well, we're live. So, welcome to History Can't Hide. For anyone who's here for the first 10 seconds, you caught us talking about the name and what it means. I'm here with a very special guest, Qasim Rashid. Needs no introduction, but I'll provide one. Qasim is a creator, a lawyer, and an activist who creates very deep and reflective and investigative content about the state of the world of society of politics today. I'll let you introduce yourself, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining. And a little bit of a fun fact for anyone who's just joining right now: Qasim is actually the person who what's it called? Recommended that I join Substack at the beginning of this year. So the reason that you're even seeing me on this platform, giving this live right now, taking the time to write articles is because of him. So thank you so much.
Thanks for being here, man. Thanks for having me. I've admired your work ever since I came across it on TikTok years ago,
Thank
and
you.
watching your platform grow and develop, it it's one of those things where I think about how our country has only ever been saved by its young people stepping up and being relentless. And you've been relentless on every
Thank
issue
you.
of justice. And so, my background, I'm an attorney, I'm a human rights lawyer, and a lot of the content I write focuses on these human rights issues that corporate media, legacy media, doesn't really bother to cover, and but need attention because it impacts us on a very personal level. I'll give you one really good example. I got to write more about this, but New York Times and Washington Post both came out with headlines yesterday or the day before slamming Wes Moore for vetoing the bill on reparations in Maryland, neglecting to mention that the reason why he vetoed that bill is because he said, I don't want to wait another 2 years to study reparations. It's time to
Mhm.
act on it now. And the way it was framed is that the only black governor in the country is anti-reparations. I mean, just nonsense. And so for me, a lot of why I write and why I investigate these issues that impact us is because, the fourth estate is failing, corporate media is crumbling, and the danger of being an uninformed populace is too high to ignore. And so to kind of partner with fellow partners in justice with you is exciting, and I'm grateful to be in this conversation with you today.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And once again, thank you for all your work. I think the great thing about a platform like Substack is that it allows for us to have these collaborations, these conversations, in a way that is completely owned by us. There's not the same constraints as something like TikTok, where you have to play the algorithm to try to go viral without any sort of guarantee that you'll get
Yeah.
any reward for it. If anything, your videos can be banned or taken off because of censorship. We all saw over the past few years how there was so many articles that came out back in 2020 about how hashtag Black Lives Matter was censored, and then going into a few years later, how posts related to Palestine and Gaza were censored.
Yep.
So there's so much that we have to fight against in other platforms. So that's all to say that for anyone joining, please make sure, we'll repeat this at the end, but for right now also, please make sure that you're subscribing to both of our newsletters. If you can, please become a paid subscriber, because it's our paid subscribers who provide the funds that are necessary to keep this going, because this is a lot of labor, a lot of time, and a lot of stress. But of course, if we could turn into our full-time gigs, then that's what makes it worthwhile, and that's what gives us more time to talk about these topics. And speaking of topics to talk about, we have reached an important milestone in societal history, and that yesterday was or what would be the 100th birthday of Malcolm X, a civil rights leader, civil rights figure, who is, I'd say, probably one of the most prominent, probably like only second to Martin Luther King Jr., Black civil rights leaders of our American history, who had a huge impact on opening up the Black consciousness, of raising movements and teaching people how to stand up against white supremacy in many different ways, many different forms. That was something that Qasim reminded me of earlier when we were talking. So we just want to take a second to recognize Malcolm X's legacy, and also just in nature of what I do, talk about the history of Black Muslims, of not necessarily the Nation of Islam specifically, but of their work, of Malcolm X and what he later on went to do when he broke away, and just generally the state of Black Muslims in activism in the United States. But before we do that, I'll let Kasim take it away and just maybe talking a little bit about like what Malcolm X's legacy means to you. Perhaps diversity amongst
Yeah.
Muslim individuals, wherever you wanna go with this.
Well, I mean, I'll start with that. Fun fact that the American Muslim community is the most racially diverse community in the United States, and the single largest demographic of American Muslims are still Black Muslims. And I say still because it's always been the case. Up to a third of the enslaved Africans brought here against their will, trafficked here, were Muslims. I've got the good fortune of when I immigrated to the U.S. At the age of 4. I have the good fortune that many of my earliest teachers at the mosque in the 1980s were Black Muslims who lived through the civil rights era, who marched in the civil rights movements, who lived through the Jim Crow era, and turned to Islam as their salvation from a racial justice perspective. I mean, a lot of the story that you hear from Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X is their story as well. And one of my mentors, who's since passed, had a comment he would make that, uh, uh, and I mean, this is something that I reflect on a lot because, you know, he was born in the 1920s and 30s, raised through the civil rights era, and died in the early 2000s. And he had a comment that was a pretty bold comment. He goes, uh, this is his words. He said, the African American community today hates everything about slavery but the Christianity. And the point that he was trying to make is that one of the most underreported stories of the Black experience has been the stripping away of Islam as a faith. It's a form of cultural and religious genocide. And, I had the privilege of going to the Black History Museum in DC for the first time finally. And while I found it a powerful and moving experience, I was a little bit disappointed that the only mention of Muslims was the Nation of Islam and
Mm.
Malcolm X. There's nothing about the rich history, the rich legacy that African enslaved Muslims contributed to this country well before the nation. I mean, the nation is an important, integral part of that history, but it's also kind of yesterday's newspaper. It's not the initial founding of the centuries prior, right? There was no mention of the fact that African explorers arrived in the New World well before Columbus did. This has been well documented by scholars. And so, to me, when I think about someone like Malcolm X and what he really brought to the table, is he mainstreamed the conversation once more, and he did it in a way that to me is extraordinarily inspiring because it's easier, I think, to point to someone who maybe comes from a history, a rich legacy, to say, well, that's just what you were born and raised into. You had the privilege of previous scholars and previous
Mhm.
academics and imams and sheikhs, but Malcolm didn't have any of that, right? Brother Malcolm came up in white supremacist Jim Crow America, suffered Klan violence, suffered white supremacist violence, got caught up in the carceral system, and then not only did he come out as a better person, but that journey never stopped. That journey perpetuated, and he talks about his experience going to Mecca for the Hajj pilgrimage and seeing black and brown and white and blue eyed and brown eyed and worshiping together, and how that really opened up his eyes to what Islam, what humanity really should be all about. And the final farewell sermon of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he said that a black person is no better than a white person, nor is a white person better than a black person. An Arab is no better than a non-Arab, nor is a non-Arab better than an Arab. You are all equal in the eyes of God, and you are your rank is based on your righteousness. It's based on your service to humanity. And so to kind of see that journey of Malcolm is one that I think about often. It's something I cherish because it's a reflection of the journey that we're all on as well. And I'll close with this, that I was thrilled because I grew up a huge Marvel fan. I was thrilled when the first time I learned that Dr. King and Malcolm reflected Professor X and Magneto
Mm.
respectively. That to me was a powerful. I mean, I was probably 12, 13 when I learned that. But I think about that often now as well. And I don't know if you've seen the X-Men reboot, the X-Men 97 reboot, but it really dives into that. It kind of leans into that more aggressively. And I'm enjoying that a lot.
Yeah, I'm also a huge X-Men fan. I was born the year that the movies came out, so like 2000 was
Nice.
the first one, 2002
Yeah.
second,
Yeah. Yeah.
so on and so forth. So yeah, that was always a parallel that was like instilled upon me, like that understanding of, obviously it's not a binary in the way that
Yeah,
fiction makes it out to be,
yeah.
but the sort of different approaches to advancing civil rights for a population, advancing human rights for a population. My dad, he's been in the comments. I've been seeing him just like posting different facts. He put the birthday from May 1925 to February 1965. I think my parents went to a event at the Shabazz Center
Oh,
yesterday,
nice.
and my dad always had a both portrait and then the autobiography of Malcolm X somewhere on a coffee table in our house. So
Amazing.
that's he's always been present. I'm in Boston right now, not too far from his house. I think in Roxbury neighborhood. So yeah, I mean that's obviously a legacy that we're all like living or being able to stand upon his shoulders in the work of those who worked with him. You mentioned the history of Black Muslims. I made a video with someone named Donnell Wright not too long ago, and he was telling the video was just about like Christian hegemony in Black history and how Black activism and the struggle to fight against white supremacy is often only framed as a struggle of like the Christian faith and Black people coming together, whether that's like organizing voting rights through churches or pastors and ministers like Martin Luther King Jr. and their sermons, which absolutely had an effect, like not to downplay any of that,
Yeah, of
but it
course.
often overshadows like the religious diversity of Black people. Even within Christianity, like it overlooks oftentimes Black Catholics over Black
Yeah,
Protestants, overlooks Black Muslims over Black Christians, overlooks Black people of indigenous African
right.
religions over Abrahamic religions. So I think the more we can be expansive on these topics, like the more that we can celebrate the diversity in religion and also the racial diversity within it as well. So I think that's like really, really, really important. I'm going to share this specific story that I wrote about not too long ago at the end of Ramadan, of how, as you mentioned, around 30%, up to 30% of the enslaved population in the United States were Muslim before coming here,
Yeah.
and one of them was a man named Omar ibn Said, and I have the paragraph right here that I wrote on him. And Omar was a enslaved person. He was captured. He was from Senegal, so like what now is Senegal. And he was a scholar captured in 1807, and he was later on enslaved in North Carolina. And one of the threads that we'll see with Islam and Black activism is this thread of literacy. So Omar was able to read and write in Arabic, and he wrote a autobiography in Arabic and also wrote down passages of the Quran that he could memorize. He outwardly sort of like pretended to conform to Christianity and play it safe with his like capturers, but he always continued to practice Islam until the day that his like autobiography was released and he passed. So he's just one of many individual stories of people that adhere to Islam through their enslavement, before their enslavement, and afterwards. And I think that's something that's very powerful, just like the what this religion and religious identity did for them. And it's something that we see carried on through the Nation of Islam, through figures like Malcolm X, is that their oratory and their literacy skills and their scholarship and their writing is what really, really, I think, above all else, made them remarkable. As well as their
Yep.
just like sort of outwardness in terms of countering and going against uh, white supremacy. I started one of my videos where I visited a church, one of the earliest churches in West Africa, or West and Central Africa, is in Angola. And I started the video off with a Malcolm X quote that got a lot of people mad when Malcolm X called Christianity the white man's religion, which I'm not saying it is, don't get me wrong. Like, Black people have definitely use Christianity and come into it. But I think it just goes to show that he was also very outspoken and unapologetic in
Yeah.
not only his critiques of religion, but his critiques of white supremacy at large. And I think there's something that we can all take away from his life story.
Well, there's. I want to double down on this point you made about Ibn Said. Outwardly pretending to be Christian while being an Islamic scholar. I mean, that to me is kind of the epitome of what historian Reverend Edward Wilmot Blyden talks about when he writes about his studies and the history of Black Christians and Black Muslims. Now, this is a Christian minister talking about this, and he points out that the real contrast is that where you find Black Muslims versus Black Christians, Black Christians were denied the right to an education. They were denied the right to attain their own higher education. That's why HBCUs exist today, for example. They were forced to build their own church on the other side of the plantation, and even then, they were denied the right to read the scriptures for themselves, lest they read about the enslaved Jewish people escaping Egypt. And he goes, on the contrary, when you look at Black Muslim communities, you see generals and scholars and poets and architects and activists and people who are Hafiz Quran that have memorized the entire Quran. And it's this contrast effectively that he makes explicitly clear that this is one of the reasons why white supremacists were so adamant on denying enslaved Muslims the ability to speak in Arabic, forcing them to eat pork, forcing them to break up their families so that they wouldn't pass on that knowledge to the next generation. There's scholarship that indicates that many of the revolts of enslaved people were led by enslaved Muslims who recognized the importance of fighting for universal humanity. And we see the transformation of the American legislative system, because initially the argument was, well, these are heathens, and so therefore we have the right to enslave them in chattel slavery and subjugate them for as long as they shall live, because they're heathens, so that they're subhuman. But then when they were, forcibly converted to Christianity, many of them, then the question that was actually proposed in Georgia, in South Carolina, in North Carolina, in the state legislatures were, well, these were heathens before, but now they're Christians. And if they're our brothers in Christ, how can we enslave them? And do you know what the official rulings were? Like the South Carolina Supreme Court, the official ruling was that, yes, they were heathens before, and yes, they are our brothers in Christ now. But because we have given them eternal salvation, the least reparations they can pay us is to serve their white masters in this life, because we have given them the gift of eternal life in the next life. And so, to me, it's how white supremacy conforms and contorts itself. There's no religion behind white supremacy. It is just white supremacy. It's fascism. Yeah. And it's hijacked Christianity for these horrific and unjust causes. And again, someone like Malcolm, when he called Christianity the white man's religion, that's what I suspect he was referring to, that you took this, beautiful community, this certainly not a homogenous community of Africans from various tribes, various cultures, various religions. You stripped away everything from them, force them to conform, and force them your version of white supremacy on them and label it Christianity. And that can be a harsh truth for many to hear, but I think this is why Malcolm was so powerful in his day and why his message today, 61 years after his assassination, still resonates as if it was a commentary on contemporary times.
Absolutely. And speaking to one of the points that you made historically, I want to just talk about the Malay Revolt. So this happened in 1835 in Salvador, and it was organized by enslaved Muslims who had planned out the entire revolt during Ramadan. So one might think that fasted is probably not the best physical time to carry out a revolt, but it was actually documented, or at least speculated by historians, that because of the fasting and because of the increased observances and religious community building that happened during Ramadan, it actually made it the more optimal time to actually organize a revolt, because it's the mental game that really matters when doing something like staging a revolt against white supremacy, against slavery, fighting for your family at all costs. Yeah, you could eat a lot and bulk up, but that's nowhere near as important as that sort of spiritual community building that you can have, that you need to do something as revolutionary as standing up to your enslavers. So the revolt happened once again in 1835, and I wouldn't say it's successful in terms of it ended slavery in Brazil per se, but it's of course successful in that it was one of many actions across all of the Americas that made slavery something that was more unstable and more ineffective to maintain, that led to abolition in each country time over time. And it's also reported in the Caribbean that enslavers recorded behaviors such as avoiding pork and fasting, that they would say were either heathen things or whatever, but they didn't really understand were actually a part of the Islamic observance, because they thought that these people were absolutely unaware of religion, unaware of the Abrahamic religions or the Bible in any way. But obviously, they had the Quran, they had access to these stories, and they knew what was going on.
Somebody asked in the comments if they're going to ask questions. I think by all means ask.
Yeah, questions. Feel free. We can start reacting to questions a little bit more now.
Yeah, would love to take some of those. And you study kind of the history of this, and there's evidence that Bailey comes from Bilali, which is Bilal, who is one of the companions of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He was an enslaved Abyssinian who the Prophet freed, and the story of his freedom is one that I always get emotional thinking about, because it is a story of resilience. And this was a man that, once the Muslims became victorious and reconquered Mecca peacefully, the two conditions that the Prophet set to the Meccans to avoid having to face capital punishment was, one, that they had to respect universal religious freedom. They didn't have to convert to Islam, but they had to let people worship or not worship as they wished. And the second condition that the Prophet set for these former enslavers, for these former fascists, to be forgiven for their crimes was they had to go to Bilal, who the Prophet handed a flag to and said, "You will find peace under the flag of Bilal." They had to go to the man that they tortured and ask him for his forgiveness and his blessing before they were allowed to stay. And to me, that speaks to two powerful things that have never happened in the United States. There's never been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States. There have never been reparations paid in the United States. So in this way, Bilal was paid his reparations because those who were his abusers then became, subservient to him, and had to ask him for his support and had to make him whole on a monetary level. But then, just as importantly, those who were the supremacists and the racists had to humble themselves. They were forced to humble themselves, or essentially die. I mean, that's the reality of it. That the condition was not that you had to convert to a different religion. The condition was that you had to humble your supremacy, your racial supremacy, and your arrogance, and recognize the equality of humanity. That was a condition. And I mean, from a historical perspective, I don't know if there's ever been a situation like that ever that's occurred. But that's one reason why you have scholars like Ina Curran Brown and Gwendolyn Midlo Hall and Edward Willard Blyden, who I mentioned, who spoke extensively about how across Africa, across Asia, you had this multiracial coalition of Muslims who worked together. That's not to say that there's not racism among Muslims. Trust me, there absolutely is. Mm-hmm. But from a historical general perspective, the consensus that was set was that here we are not going to have a racial hierarchy. We are actually going to find ways to collaborate and work together. And that's why you saw this massive growth of the Muslim empire across Arabs and Persians and Africans. Within the first 100 years, it became the largest empire in history. It spread all the way to Indonesia, which to this day, by the way, is the largest Muslim majority country in the world. And it wasn't spread by force or by the sword or by any kind of violence. It was spread by trade and by the sheer treatment of the basic humanity in one another. And I think that in the world we live in right now, that's kind of my measuring stick for any person. I really don't care what a person's faith is or is not. It's actually irrelevant to me in the sense that I'm not going to be asked about it. It doesn't matter to me. What I want to know is, how does that faith contribute to how you treat other people? Because you can call yourself a saint and dress nice and preach the gospel or preach the Quran, but if I see you mistreat the waiter, if I see you mistreat the blue collar worker, that tells me all I need to know. And so for me, that really is what this comes down to: is how are we treating those around us, and how are we creating a world that's better, and how are we using the tools and the vehicles we have available to us to elevate these calls for justice. And actually, I want to ask you a question, this, because obviously we come from different faith backgrounds, but I am so inspired by your commitment to justice. I've seen so few people with large platforms outside the broader Muslim community relentlessly speak up for Palestine, relentlessly speak up for Sudan, relentlessly speak up for Yemen and for these other injustices that are being committed. What drives you to do that? What motivates you to say, I'm not going to be silent on these issues. I need to speak up. I need to be heard on these issues?
Yeah, funny enough, I'd say like my origin story actually comes from, so I did not do activism pretty much whatsoever. In the early years of my life, I think I was coming from like more of a place, or just a generation, especially of the Black community, that arose, like my parents at least like grew up through the 70s and 90s, where like the ideal is set by like the shows like Good Times, The Jeffersons, like Cosby, Family Matters, like the whole thing of just like keep your head down, get a good job. Like the civil rights movement was successful in one way or another. Like let's just try to advance ourselves as like a family to then get out of whatever like hoods or whatever we were in before until now. So I mean I grew up outside of DC, like in the suburbs of Maryland, but I was more of like just going to school to get a good job in STEM, get a degree. Then I got accepted into Yale University, which was obviously a great thing. I was very, very grateful for it. But it was like my time there that radicalized me. Like seeing some of those students and like their families and how much wealth they had. At the same time, like how much they just didn't care about school. How some of them were just doing like literally hard drugs all the time. And how I knew that those same people would be like the CEOs and board leaders, and then everyone around me back at home would just be like, oh hey, look at that rich guy. Like they're sort of like Elon Musk of the world, how like many young men treat them like, oh that's someone who made it. Like they did it. They worked hard to get to where they are. And it's like no, like seeing it up close, seeing the privilege up close, and just seeing how like the world actually works is very radicalizing. Because you realize that everything is rigged. That the game is set up, that the poor are meant to stay poor, and the rich are definitely doing everything they can to stay rich. And then other after that, you see other injustices. Like I was going to work at a consulting company for a long time, and that same consulting company was found to be complicit in causing the opioid crisis in Appalachia. They were also working with like government regimes disappearing people. And you just see like the when you're at the top, I think you see how messed up the world is, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Either like ignore it, sort of like I don't know if you've ever read the poem or like the short story. It's called "The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas," but it's basically about like this utopian society. Everything's perfect, but there's only one condition, that there's like this child who has to like stay in a room and just like be tortured for all of time. And when you turn like 14 or something, you are made aware of this child being tortured. And then there's some people who like stay in the utopia and just like whatever ignore it, and there's some people who like are just too disgusted that they leave to go to like the real
Mhm.
world. And like I find myself, at least I like to think of myself as the person who like once you see that, like you just gotta get out and do something about it. You can't stay in the bliss of ignorance. So I think that's what keeps me going, is just like that sort of that realization that like everything is really messed up unless people are actively working to do their best to try to change it.
Yeah, and you look at examples of that throughout American history. I often talk about, the Claudette Colvins and the Irene Morgans, the
Hmm.
Robert Smalls and the Muhammad Khans and the Elizabeth Freemans of the world. These are all people in their teens, 20s, and 30s that, if you don't recognize those names that I just said, you might some of them, but you should recognize all of them and more.
Hmm.
Because these are the young people in their teens, 20s, and 30s that were seismic and historic in ending slavery and ending the misogyny we see, that combated against the military-industrial complex. Um, do we have any questions here in the? I thought I saw a
I
couple
know people
actually.
have been commenting. Yeah, we can take a second. One thing about Substack that they need to do is like these
Yeah,
comment like scrolling the comments is actually like a challenge.
I know, I know. It's like, how do
So
I?
small, and I keep tapping something to make it even smaller, so then I can't. Okay. Um, Someone said they felt the same going to Stanford. Someone else said that this radicalization happens when they're in non-black spaces. I think yeah, it does. I mean, obviously, there's many black radicals who grew up with black people, who have always been around black people more or less. But yeah, in my opinion, like I think especially being around non-black people in like higher class, higher wealth spaces, like it's just such a shock of like realizing how these people actually are, and how I want to really honestly say undeserving they are of like the life and lavish that they live, that like
Yeah.
kind of drives you a bit crazy.
Do you? Here's a question that's kind of squishy and esoteric, but do
Yeah.
you see do you see leaders like Dr. King, Malcolm X, and Fred Hampton as the iconic folks they are because they suffered assassination, or do you see that they would have been viewed the same way had they lived full lives? And the reason why I asked that question is because the follow up question is who are the Fred Hamptons of today? Who are the Malcolm X's of today that we should be elevating and supporting and looking up to?
To answer the first question, I think they definitely are like sort of they become like they were turned to martyrs because they were assassinated and killed at a younger age, for sure. I don't think, I mean, like John Lewis lived at a long life, and he of course will like always be in the sort of the zeitgeist of like civil rights leaders that you can
Yeah.
look up to. But I think that's rare. I do think that because they died when they were younger, that adds another level of like a legendary status that
Yeah.
yeah, it turns them almost not what's the right word, like canonizes them in a way.
Sure.
Um, and then that being said, today I don't think there's any analogous person today, like for sure. There's actually a class that I took in school that was called Grand Strategy. We kind of like had discussions about this. And one big change that you see between now and then is that a lot of the movements today are leaderless movements, whereas movements of before were like leadered movements. Part of that just comes from like the amount of information we have on people, so it's just a lot harder for someone like, for example, if Martin Luther King Jr., no shade to him, all respect. If he was doing some of the stuff that he was doing back then, today, I don't think he would
Yeah.
last very long as someone that people would exalt. And then even the people who like led movements today. So let's like talk about the three women behind Black Lives Matter. Like there's no shortage of attacks based on like either them buying houses or like
Yeah.
their own religious beliefs. I think some of them were like in traditional African religious leaders or something like that. Like there's so many things to nitpick on. And then also people are just not organized the same way. I don't think there's the same solidarity, right? Like
Yeah.
black women still vote by and large similarly. Black men like also like 80% voted for Harris. But I would imagine that back then during the civil rights movement where like everyone who was black was facing anti-blackness in a very specific legalized way. They were kind of all on board on the same
Yeah.
page.
Yeah.
Right now, even though the numbers aren't showing like this huge fracturing in the black community, there are enough prominent voices, a la like Candace Owens and people like that, for the community to feel more divided, right? Like there's no
Yeah.
like one policy that we all get behind because some black people just want to be like super uber rich and call it a day. Others want like full on socialism because like that's the only way that black liberation will come is if we like tear down the capitalist system. And people switch, people betray each other, whatever. It just seems so hard to organize
Yeah.
in the way that people organized in the 1960s, which might be a little bit bleak, but I do think there are like smaller communities and smaller leaders. I like to think of myself, at least in the
100%.
education space, as
Yeah.
one of them
100%.
that
Yeah.
are trying to do the work.
100%. And I also wonder how much of that has to do with the legacy of COINTELPRO,
Oh,
the Hoover program that actively targeted Black civil rights movements and actively took them down, and actively tried to, it led to the assassinations of the aforementioned icons as well. And, I guess, and we've been going on for a little bit, so I guess try to wrap it up. I guess, where do you hope to see in the coming years? I mean, where do you see things going? Because I will say this, I cringe a little bit when people say we're in unprecedented times, because it tells me you haven't actually studied history. We're
mhm.
unfortunately in very precedented times, where you've got a president who's a white supremacist and a complicit Congress who is actively passing, white supremacist policies. You've got a Supreme Court that's a hyper right-wing Supreme Court. People forget, only for about 12 years during the Civil Rights Acts did we actually have a left-leaning court. Throughout much of American history, the majority of the Supreme Court has been hyper right wing, hyper white supremacy. Justice Taney's bust, who ruled on Dred Scott and said black people aren't citizens because they're subhuman. It stood in the halls of Congress till like what 2017 or something. So there's um, there's not a shortage of examples throughout American history that we can look to that says this is not the first time we've been here. Unfortunately, because we've never had a truth and reconciliation, because we've never truly had meaningful reparations, restitution, meaningful acknowledgement of the genocide and the slavery upon which this country was built, it's going to perpetuate. And I guess you can call them wins, but the situations where a plantation burns down can't be the win. That can't be well, now we're even. No, that's not how it works, right? That's a thing, but it's definitely nothing substantive or meaningful for the grand scheme of meaningful racial and economic justice. Professor Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about this extensively. That even if you are anti-reparations for enslavement, what about reparations for Jim Crow and redlining? I mean, there's just so much. So, what do you see? I mean, you're what 25 right now. What do you see when you're going to be my age? When you're in your 40s, in 15 and 20 years, where do you want the country to go, and how do you want folks to support the work you're doing to help us get there?
Yeah, that's a great. I'm going to answer one of the comments questions, and I have that in the
Yeah.
back of my mind just because I want to make sure that people who comment feel seen. There's only one question; the rest are comments, and we acknowledge all your comments. Well, this one says, "Glad that Yale gave you that awakening. Would you go there again? I'm in favor of higher education for everyone." So everything I said about Yale held true. I did have a very, I would say, useful experience, and I
Mm,
would go there again. I think seeing all of that and that radicalization is one reason I would want to be radicalized. I don't want to stay asleep. And then also just like the access that it gives you. I think higher education is very important. That might be a little bit biased, and obviously there's all these conversations around like don't go into debt, like get a trade. I don't believe you should go into debt. I think you should always find the most cost effective program for you. And I think a lot of state schools are becoming ideally more cost effective over especially like the mid tier private universities where they don't have great financial aid and they're very expensive. I would say like yeah, just cut those out. But like luckily Ivy Leagues, in my experience, they have great financial aid, so like you don't have to pay much if you're coming from needs. Or state schools or community colleges, I believe some of which are community colleges might be like free or like lower costs. I would say I do value higher education. I do think like the programized way of like reading canon and engaging with other people from around the world, from around the country, is very useful. That's probably the main reason in my head. But that said, to your question, Kasim, I don't know. I think I will say I will maybe like a counter perspective just a little bit. I think the thing that makes me a little bit pessimistic in terms of like why I do feel like it's somewhat unprecedented now is that like white supremacy has always been in America. People have always been racist. I will say it doesn't for most of that time, like I do believe some people knew it was wrong for sure. Like you just know, like whatever religious text, like you know you're not supposed to treat people that way. But I do think that like they didn't have the education for it. Like they didn't necessarily like have like the scientific studies, the historical understanding, of like people on TikTok telling you like how race developed and why it's wrong and all of that. I feel like in 2020, though it did not reach everyone, a generally large swath of the population had some form of like racial justice education put onto them, whether by choice or not, right? Whether it was a DEI program at work, or like they came across a TikTok or a news report showing like the high cases of police violence, the history of slavery, and how it led to mass incarceration. And I think that was like in my mind, like one of the sort of like the goalposts, right? Like we want to just get everyone like once everyone realizes like what race is, why racism is bad, like we're gonna be okay, like the history of it, the nitty gritty, like they see something shocking, and I think to have that happen and then have such intense backlash, like I think that's what scares me, right? Like the fact that people, by and large, know, like mostly people know Christopher Columbus was not a good guy. Like, yeah, you grew up hearing that you played it in Cowboys and Indians, whatever. But like, come 2020, there were enough think pieces about it on like every news source, BuzzFeed, whatever, for you to know that's wrong. And then to have like these white supremacists, far right conservatives, or like the woman who called the black child the N word, to have all this happen, I think with that knowledge, like knowing for sure that these people know it's wrong and like know the history, like not just in a emotional capacity know it's wrong, but like know intellectually why it's wrong, and for them to still do it is quite jarring. And I think that that's probably like once again, it probably happened before in history, like the backlash of the civil rights movement, but like to see it happen in such a scale right now feels pretty jarring for me. I will say by the time I am at your age, I would hope that there's enough of a sort of like simmering down of like the far right fascism that people can just intellectually realize that there are very strong cases for things like reparations and anti-racism and everything that's been demonized as like woke and like radical ideology. I think I just hope that those become normalized as the sort of like bare minimum that yes, reparations are a thing. Jewish people got reparations from the United States and Germany after the Holocaust. Native American tribes got reparations when treaties were broken. Not all of them, of course, and they deserve a lot more. Two, Japanese got like. There's so many instances that where this happened that it feels weird to like cut off at Black people. So like that's one argument that I think is should be widely
yeah.
acknowledged. Also, when you count reparations for Jim Crow as well, and then also just like the it feels like it's crazy we have to go back to this, but like that everyone is equal, right? Like that there's so many even newsletters on Substack and Twitter accounts that are just dedicated to like the supremacy of the Western civilization and like talking about how the Near East and like Islamic cultures are just barbaric and crazy and like how Africans are savages and whatever, so on and so forth. Like that's becoming trendy and popular and very mainstream again, though it's always bubbling there. and I just feel like I just want that to be demonized again, and for like people to love diversity, like sort of like the '90s kids shows, like Sesame Street, like everyone's like there's like a Chinese kid, and like a black kid, and a white kid, whatever. Like I feel like we have to go back to that because I thought that we like there were still issues then, but it feels like comparatively that was a good place. At least we could have a black character without that black actor being attacked on the internet ruthlessly to no end.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, well said. We should have another conversation about it because I think Dr. Michelle Alexander talks about this as well in her book, The New Jim Crow, where she just points out that the knowledge is actually not enough.
Yeah.
Because I think you're right that people I think have more knowledge, but she would point out that knowledge is not enough, and people, in her estimation, mistake racism for ignorance when she points out that these modern systems of mass incarceration, for example, or the war on drugs, or the disparity in police violence in black versus white neighborhoods, that it's not due to ignorance, it's due to becoming more sophisticated and extremely. I was talking to somebody a wealthy white guy in his 50s, who was running for office, and he couldn't understand that redlining was a real thing. He didn't believe it.
Mm.
And this is a person who's college graduate, worth millions of dollars, running for office, and thought I was lying to him about redlining. Thought I was lying to him about the GI Bill being only for white soldiers, not, and then just the impact of that. He was like, "Well, I don't understand why these black schools are so downtrodden. Why can't they just use the property taxes?" I'm like, "What? Like, what
Yeah.
planet are you on?" So I see your point. I think you're exactly right that people have gotten the education. I think where I would go one step further is that I just don't think that's enough.
Yeah, I think I'm coming to realize that now. I wish
Yeah.
I, I wish I was at your wisdom or had read
About
Michelle
that, but
Alexander's book before.
no, it's a good read. I think you'll enjoy it because I think it validates the point you're making that the people are aware, and I think it just speaks to the additional work that needs to be done, and that's why I'm encouraging everyone who's watching this on my platform to make sure you subscribe to the Gen Z historian History Can't Hide from Khalil Green, because the work he does, it's not only authentic and fact checked, but it's also a lot of fun, and I find myself learning new stuff from you constantly, which to me is a dopamine hit. That's what I love most, and that's what you give me every single time. So I appreciate that.
No, thank you, and right back at you. Anyone who follows me, make sure you follow or subscribe to Costumes newsletter. It's called Let's Address This, right? I make sure I got that right.
Yeah, let's address this. That's right.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect. So I got that right. Make sure to subscribe if you can for both of us. If you're I'm one of my subscribers and you're joining Costumes, if you're one of Costumes subscribers joining me, please do if you're able to become a paid subscriber. I think both of us give out all of our work for
Yep.
free.
No
But
paywall.
yeah,
Yep.
no paywalls because we're trying to
Yep.
get as much reach as possible. There are a lot of other creators who are supposedly activists and for the movement and doing politics that have a huge fat paywall and exclusivity behind their content. We do not have that. The only way that we can continue is through people out of the goodness of their own heart, subscribing, giving paid sponsorship. So please, 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 please engage and subscribe to both of our stuff. There's some comments here. I do believe I believe that when I post this, those comments will come up as
Yep.
comments to the article, so I can respond to you through a written format if I didn't not get to your question in the live. But until then, thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Peace.
Bye.